Hey there, this is Dr. Mort Orman, and this week I want to talk to you about a very important subject, a very broad subject, and it's the subject of cognitive biases. Now, as many of you know, this is the kind of thing I like to focus on, I like to talk about and help people understand because I'm interested in helping people become better at identifying the internal causes of their stress, not so much the external causes that everybody can see, but the thought processes, behavior processes inside of us that tend to contribute to our stress, but we're not likely to spot these causes as easily. And that's why cognitive biases are really important because they're very frequent. There's a large number of them. They've been studied for 20 or 30 or 40 years by psychologists and other types of scientists. We all have them. We all suffer from them. And basically, what a cognitive bias is, it's just a pattern of thinking. It's a sort of a established tendency to think in certain ways that sometimes can be useful, but much of the time they tend to cause distortions in our perceptions, distortions in the conclusions that we draw, sometimes the feelings that we have or the thoughts that we have, and how we behave. They're all tied together. But at the root of it is misperceiving the way the world really works and the way things actually happen. And that can lead to a lot of stress in our lives. So that's basically what a cognitive bias is. And like I said, there's many of them been identified. We're only going to go into a few of them this week. Each day I'll touch on a couple of them. But today I just wanted to talk about the overall principle and how widespread they are. In fact, just to give an example of one type of cognitive bias that's been identified, there's a bias called the blind spot bias. Because cognitive biases produce blind spots all over the place, and yet we have a giant blind spot to how biased we are most of the time. We may be able to see other people being biased, but when it comes to ourselves, we have this blind spot where we don't see how many biases we have, how often they are involved in our thinking and our judgments, and the conclusions that we draw, and the stress that we experience. So that's one example of a blind spot or a bias that's been identified. Another one that a lot of people don't know about was something that Einstein said about how science proceeds. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to do with our day-to-day stresses, but Einstein made a very insightful insight into how science proceeds. And he says the typical bias that most people have today is a misunderstanding. It says, and the bias is that the way scientists work is they look out into the world and they see things that they want to understand, and then they ask questions and then devise experiments to try to answer those questions. And he said that's the typical idea that most people have about how science proceeds. He says, no, that's not how it works at all. He says, first and foremost, all science is done by human beings. All human beings have biases. And one of the biggest biases scientists have is that they can only think of questions that are allowed by the culture and the society that they live in at that particular time in history. And they can't ask questions that deviate from, in a big way, from what most people believe is reasonable thinking. So there's an inherent, from the get-go, before a scientist even starts to think about what they want to study, they have lopped off certain questions that cannot be asked, that are forbidden. And they're not even aware that there are forbidden questions, but every society has them. So, for example, before Einstein's time, nobody would have ever thought of doing any kind of science that involved a principle that time is not uniform everywhere in the universe and that distance is not uniform everywhere in the universe or under different circumstances. Nobody would have thought that. Nobody could have thought that. And nobody could have designed any kind of science to discover or investigate that because they would have never thought of the question in the first place. It would have never come to mind. It was prohibited, not actively, but by what was deemed to be acceptable and reasonable thinking patterns in the society. And I actually take it back. It really does have something to do with the stress we have because that's exactly what's happening today with how people are thinking about stress. We've been taught to think about stress in certain ways, and only certain ways of thinking about it are legitimate. And if you think about it in any other way than what is being sold to us as the cultural way to think about stress, then you're crazy and you need to be disqualified and your thoughts can't have any validity. Well, I've shown over the last 30 years that there's actually better ways of dealing with stress. And the problem is that we've all been brainwashed into thinking a certain way that's really ineffective and doesn't help us. So I just wanted to give you a little introduction to what we'll be doing this week. One of the reasons why I didn't pick this topic for this week is because last week on Friday, I was a guest on a very interesting podcast run by somebody named Adam Lowry, who authored a book called The Cognitive Rampage, and he has a podcast by that same name called The Cognitive Rampage Podcast. And we got into discussing some of these issues about biases and a whole bunch of other topics. We had a wonderful time. The interview actually went on for quite a while, about an hour, almost an hour and a half, but it's chock full of great information and great ideas and back and forth between the two of us. And I highly recommend that you take a look at that. All you have to do is go to YouTube and search for Cognitive Rampage, and you'll see Adam Lowry's channel. If you go on that channel, you'll be able to quickly find where the podcasts are located, and you can watch the whole interview. And hopefully you'll enjoy watching it as much as I enjoyed talking with Adam and interacting with him back and forth on a variety of subjects related to human beings and stress and cognitive distortions. Excuse me, I have a little something flying in my glasses here. And so that's what we're going to do this week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.